Looking for a guaranteed way to create content that resonates with your audience? Start a podcast. Interview your ideal clients and let them choose the topic of the interview. Because if your ideal clients care about the topic, there's a good chance the rest of your audience will care about it too. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to another episode of the B2B website series here on B2B Growth, where we discuss practical and actionable topics to meet you wherever you are in your website journey. My name is Eric Sharp, and I'm your host. If you're a returning listener to this series, welcome back. If this is your first episode, thank you for your time. I do not take that for granted. Just to quickly catch you up, the 3 prior episodes are solo episodes where I explored 3 different topics: 12 common website issues, how B2B websites convert visitors to leads, and the third one, just released about a week and a half ago, how a website revamp could blow your budget. In this episode, I am going to change up things a bit. I was getting tired of talking to myself, so we're shifting to more of a conventional podcast format, and I am bringing in a guest. And that guest is Joe Sullivan, the thinker and co-founder of Gorilla 76, a marketing agency that focuses on serving B2B manufacturers. Joe, how you doing today, man?
Doing well, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. You and I, Joe, just met a couple of weeks ago. I was doing research on a future episode just around some of the core elements of a B2B website, which I have thought long and hard about and have written about before, but I was like, I just want a fresh perspective. And I came across an article on your site and connected with you. And then we started having some conversations and pretty much realized that we were brothers from another mother for how much we have in common. And I mean, aside from the whole Packers Bears issue that we got going on, I mean, everything else, yeah, you and I have connected very, very quickly on. So I'm excited, man, to just keep having conversations with you and do this particular episode. But before we dive into that, Joe, just can you tell everyone who's listening a little bit about you and what you guys do at Gorilla 76?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are about a 20-person agency. We're based in St. Louis, Missouri. And we say that we help mid-sized B2B manufacturers identify, attract, engage, and drive sales opportunities with ideal fit customers. So a lot of our work is, starts focused around strategy and helping our clients figure out how to get from point A to point B through various marketing strategies. So a lot of our work tends to focus in the inbound arena and account-based marketing. Content finds its way into everything we do. So that's kind of the brief overview. We've been in business for about 12 years. So.
And I love your title, thinker and co-founder, because not a lot of people like to stick with the traditional titles, right? But based upon some of the content that I've read, and you and I are kind of in the same space, I think that's a great description, because your content is really thought through well, and I was really impressed, and big reason why we're talking right now.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. It's funny, since our earliest days when it was just myself and my business partner John, we had thinker and fill in the blank in our job title, and that sits on the business card of every one of our employees. That's something we've stuck with, and people get a laugh out of it. And I think it speaks well to the idea of strategy before implementation. They're both important pieces of the mix, but you got to do the thinking before you do the doing.
Couldn't agree more. I absolutely love it. Well, in this particular episode, we are going to be thinking and talking about a particular topic that is really the theme of the article that I found you guys by just Googling some things. I mean, and that article is named "If Your Website Were a House to Repaint, Rehab, or Rebuild." Now, this idea I've also explored too. Joe, you and I were talking before we hit record here that I wrote an article called "Dynamite or Fresh Paint: How to Evaluate a Website Makeover." So you and I have really thought long and hard about this idea of, hey, you don't necessarily need to blow up your website. You don't need to rebuild it. There are other ways of incrementally improving your website rather than, again, pulling out the dynamite and just lighting things on fire and starting anew. So you and I are going to talk through this idea. I've got my blog and my ideas on this, and you've got yours. And I think we're just going to kind of merge those ideas together and provide our audience with some really, really good takeaways. If someone is listening here and you're thinking about maybe revamping your website, I know the episode number 3 of the B2B website series, I explored how a website revamp could blow your budget. But I think we're even going to take a step back from there and say, hey, do you even need to do a website revamp? Here are some options. So I'm really excited for this. I know you are, Joe.
I am as well.
Cool, man. All right. So let's talk through these 3 options. And I'm going to kind of turn it over to you, Joe, and let you kind of give an overview of this idea of 3 options when it comes to your website, right? And again, that's repaint, rehab, or rebuild to kind of fall in line with the house metaphor. So go ahead. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, as another agency owner, Eric, I'm sure you see this a lot, but the reason that a lot of companies kind of wind up on our doorstep in the first place has something to do with their website. It's a central piece of kind of your home base with your online marketing. And I think the reason that a lot of our clients or prospects or leads show up on our doorstep, though, looking for a new website is sometimes the wrong reason. And we see ourselves in a situation where we're kind of asking the many layers of, well, why do you need the new website? Well, it looks unprofessional. Well, why does that matter? It's detracting potential customers for us or whatever. So a lot of times the real reason is deeper than our website looks ugly and we look unprofessional, and there's something below the surface. It's usually some business outcome that they're trying to get to, and their website is causing problems in terms of how to get there. So it kind of reminds me of any kind of professional, like a doctor prescribing a medication or whatever it might be, where you don't walk into the doctor's office and in most scenarios at least and say, here's what I have and what I need you to prescribe for me. You hire the doctor to sort of diagnose the problem and figure out what the best solution is. And so we see that as our job. And a lot of times it's, for a client to walk in and say, I need a new website, and for us to say, okay, sounds good. That's going to cost X amount of money. We see it as our job to say, okay, well, what are you trying to accomplish here? And a lot of times the reality is that a website redesign and or rebuild is not really the thing that's going to get them to the outcome they're looking for. And so that's kind of what drove this article and what drives a lot of the preliminary conversations I have with people. Well, a lot of people who walk in the door who do wind up being clients of ours, what we wind up actually delivering for them may not be a full website rebuild, or at least in that first year. So, the fresh coat is sort of the first option, and then to rehab it and then to totally rebuild it. There are different scenarios that would lead me to say you should go this route or this route or this route.
Yeah, that's great. And I think for our listeners, what we're going to do is we're going to explore each of these 3 options. So if you're kind of in that boat, like Joe just described, where you're kind of thinking about blowing up your site, we're going to give you some really good practical takeaways and maybe some very specific details to look for with your current website to make that decision, right? To make that decision to just maybe add some fresh paint, or make that decision to maybe rehab it, not completely blow it up, but make some big changes, but not a complete rebuild. And then the last option, of course, is there are going to be scenarios where you just need to blow things up and start anew. And so I think, Joe, in my article, like you and I talked about, I got some very specific things that you can look for in your website, which are kind of the signals. The writing is going to be on the wall that you do need to rebuild if you're kind of talking about these similar issues with your site. So let's get through that. Let's start there, Joe. Let's start with the repaint, right? Because that seems to be the easier of the three. And then the last one we'll address is the rebuild, which, is a little bit more of a hardy conversation. But let's start with repaint. Like when would a business look at their website and say, you know what, let's just apply some fresh paint? Like, what are some things to look for there?
Yeah. So the first, I have three things here. And the first is if lead generation is a low priority. And so, an example of that would be, maybe you have a total addressable market of just maybe 20 potential customers. You're in a tight niche and you serve, huge enterprise organizations in some industry vertical. And there are 10 or 20 or 30, limited amount of potential customers out there. Or maybe you're in a bigger space, but you've sort of penetrated the market, or you have, really significant awareness already. And so, in those scenarios, you're probably dealing with, your marketing strategy probably revolves more around direct marketing, where you're going directly at those accounts because you know who they are, and maybe because they know who you are, or some type of nurturing or sales approach. So I guess if lead gen is a lower priority, then it's really about looking great and your information being what those people are looking for, as opposed to needing to get discovered. So that's my first point. The second one is if your company is looking to be acquired. So we have a few clients of ours right now who are in, say, year 3 or 4 of a 5-year private equity firm investment cycle, where a company is bought into the organization. They are trying to, raise the value and the sort of the perceived value and the brand image of the company. And that's another scenario where a fresh coat can go a long way. You're putting similar to if you were selling your house and you put a fresh coat on the outside, it's going to look, the curb feels better, and you're going to get more foot traffic in when you have your open house. So that's number 2. And then the third one is if you either know or suspect that you're missing opportunities left and right. If you're literally hearing from people, you guys you don't look like you've got it together. You don't look like a legitimate company. And sadly enough, in the audience I serve, there are enough companies out there that have, websites that haven't been touched in 10 or 15 years. And it just reflects poorly on the company. And so really the top priority is, let's just get this thing down and replaced with something that doesn't make us, doesn't cause more damage than good.
Yeah, that's really good. I like just to bring up the professionalism, right, of the overall site, especially if it's very dated and it doesn't look modern, and there's maybe some mobile issues, which typically if you have a dated website, it's not going to be mobile friendly, right? So this idea of the aesthetics, I don't like to focus a lot on the aesthetics because a lot of times, and Joe, I know you've heard this before, and you mentioned this when we first started talking, is about asking why they need a revamp. A lot of people are just thinking, you replace the visual design, the aesthetics, and then it's going to fix all these lead gen efforts just because you got a good looking website, which, I know is not the case. So I just wanted to put that disclaimer in there before I say this. But, the aesthetics, if you do have a lot of sound stuff and you're doing things well, if you just focus on the aesthetics, like, for example, if you've got a lot of great content, right, that maybe is got a lot of great organic traffic coming to it, but it's just kind of aesthetically, it's not good looking. So maybe the font is too small, or you're not necessarily your headers, like, your H2 and your H3 that kind of break up the content. Maybe they're not formatted in a way that allows people to sort of scan and skim your content. Maybe the colors need to be adjusted. Maybe you need to have a darker font. Things like that, I think, is kind of what you're talking about, right? When it comes to restylizing some things and just kind of taking this incremental approach.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's the face of the company, and I agree with you that you can only get so far with a visual overhaul of your site. And again, it's a scenario where I would only recommend the fresh coat of paint in these scenarios where the appearance is the thing that's most important. It doesn't mean your site's gonna serve as a better business tool for you other than just sort of the outward appearance of it. So it's very surface level, but yeah, that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Those aesthetic changes, typography, colors, imagery.
And some of that stuff may be like uber critical, right? So if they've gone through a rebranding effort where they have a new logo and a new color palette, and the current site is just not reflective of those new branding standards. I mean, that is an easy answer, right? Where it's like, yes, if you're doing a lot of other things well, and you've just gone through a rebrand and you want your new site to reflect that, like, yeah, you don't necessarily need to blow things up. You can do an aesthetic sort of transplant in that sort of scenario, which I'm sure you've seen before too, right, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And another one kind of, along those lines, it would be, a company that the thing that they sell is in and of itself, the aesthetic appearance of that thing is important. Like, for example, we've dealt with some clients in say the label manufacturing or packaging space, and what they're selling is the beauty of packaging or product design, and then when their website, when their own website looks like it was built 15 years ago, how does that reflect on a company that sells something visual themselves? So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think the repaint of the three options here seems to probably be maybe as far as the time commitment and the financial resources need to pull off, are probably the least expensive, I would say, Joe, right? Is kind of how we're framing this. So as we work through this, we go from repaint to rehab to rebuild. Your costs are probably going to increase as we go along, right?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure you and I are on the same page there, because I want to move into rehab, because repaint seems to be pretty straightforward, but things start to get a little bit gray as we move towards the rehab. Like, how do you rehabilitate, a website in a way that doesn't look like a complete rebuild? So let's spend a little time there. And I'm going to turn this back over to you to kind of talk through what you mentioned in this article of, what would be some core reasons why you would want to rehab rather than repaint or rebuild?
Sure. Well, I've got 3 points for this one too. So the first one is, if the information on your site is up to date and well written, but it's all about you. And so what I mean here is, your site is a brochure, a digital brochure. It talks about who you are, how great you are, how amazing your customer service is, how you have the best people in the world. All that stuff is lip service, and your customers don't care about it. Your prospects don't care about any of that until they believe that you understand the problems they're experiencing, that you've seen them before, that you know how to address them. And so, what one type of rehab here would be, because you need that brochure content, you need some of that explains your capabilities and your products and services. But, really the core of your website needs to be the stuff that is, positions you as a thought leader and an expert in your space, and addresses the buying triggers that your customers have, and the pains and the goals that they have, and all the related questions they have. So, usually it's the matter of building out a blog or learning center or resource center, or whatever you want to call it, that can house a base of resourceful content that you're going to publish on an ongoing basis: white papers, blog posts, video content, tools, podcasts like this, whatever it might be. So that's one type of rehab, is to start putting together and bolting on the stuff that is going to position you as a thought leader. The second point is, if you've got, and I kind of like this one because I've seen this in a few scenarios with our own clients, where you've got a significant amount of website traffic already, but you're getting no leads from your site. So this is kind of the tail end of inbound lead generation, where we had one client, for example, a few years back, who we kind of thought the website rebuild was going to be the first thing we did for them, but we dove into their analytics and saw, well, they're getting 2,000-3,000 visits a month to their site, and based on what the data is telling us, the pages they're landing on out of Google searches, like, we think that people are looking for the right stuff, and probably some of these visitors are actually qualified, but they're getting 2-3 leads a month out of 2,000 to 3,000 visits a month. And so we said, all right, well, let's put a lead generation infrastructure in place on this site. Let's create some gated content that visitors will trade their contact information for willingly, so we can kind of help our clients step into the buying process. Other things you could do are install live chat or a chatbot software like Drift, and start. If you're looking for ways to turn an anonymous website visitor into a tangible lead with a name, a phone number, and an email address. So that sort of conversion optimization element to it can be a bolted on thing that you can do as part of a rehab, as opposed to tearing down and starting from scratch. And then the last one is, if you really do need a full rebuild, like you need it, but you're just constrained by budget. Rather than waiting 2 years until you can build enough budget or convince whoever needs to be convinced at your company to invest in this, make the 20% of changes that are going to produce 80% of results. And this one is, some of the listeners may be familiar with the concept of growth-driven design that came from Luke Summerfield originally with HubSpot, I think, and the idea of sort of this continuous improvement process, where you tear down what you've got, or at least kind of in this case, you address the most important stuff, and then on an ongoing basis, there's a continuous improvement process where you keep dealing with what's the most important next change to make. So yeah, those are my points there.
I love that. And let me jump in here, Joe, and talk through some of the specifics you had in these 3 points. I think the first one, I love that you mentioned this brochure-ish type of website. I wrote an article, I don't know, it feels like forever ago, but it was actually, I just looked up the date. It was only 5 years ago. And the title of it is Why a Brochure Website Doesn't Work Anymore. And it's actually one of our top landing pages of our entire website. So this idea of kind of just having a website that's all about you, right? It's just pretty much a brochure of your company and expecting it to drive results. Definitely some rehab needed if that is the case. One good practical takeaway for you listening that will allow you to kind of look at your website and know whether or not you have a brochure website is to look at all of your content on your site. So if that's 50 pages or 5,000 pages, if 80% of that content is all about you, right? So about us and our history and our leadership and, yada, yada, yada. And then 20% is actually helpful content, like you mentioned, Joe, that's going to establish you as a thought leader. You've got that formula completely switched around. You need to have more of a 80-20 approach where 80% of your content is helpful to your audience, that's educational, that's going to establish you as a thought leader. And then 20% is going to be, that brochure-ish type of content. Now, this formula I learned from Valuable Content. They're located over in the UK. I've been following them for years. And she wrote a blog article years ago that talked about this 80-20 formula. And I've just loved it so much and have been kind of exposing my clients to it. But that's a good way. Have you heard of that formula, the 80-20? I'm sure you have, because you mentioned 80-20 in the last point that you said here, Joe.
Yeah, I have heard of that, and I completely agree with it. It just comes down to this idea that nobody cares about you. They care about themselves and their problems and what they're trying to accomplish as a company. And once they've figured out how to address their issue and started vetting potential solution providers, that's when they start to care about you a little bit. But there's so much of the buyer's journey that happens before anybody's ready to have a conversation, and that data is becoming more and more, available to us. That sort of validates that, and we've got to treat websites as great sources of information before we look at them as serving ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Couldn't agree more. So your third bullet, Joe, you mentioned budget. And I just want to share a little bit of our experience there with another client. I was thinking about this particular podcast, Joe, with you. And I was like, I mentioned this when we first talked a couple weeks ago, where I have a client where this was the situation where when they first came to us, they did have decent traffic. They did have decent rankings, but their site was missing a lot of the core fundamental things that a B2B lead gen site needs. For example, they didn't have a call to action really clear anywhere, and which again is going to decrease conversion rate. It's going to make people hunt for it. That's not what you want them to do. You want your call to action to be very crystal clear. So I was noticing these sort of things. I was noticing the call to action. I was noticing that he was running WordPress, and none of his plugins were updated. There were some usability issues. So in the first year engagement with them, we did take this rehab approach where we said, you know what, you could really use a complete blow up right now and redesign your site, but that, it's going to take us 4 to 6 months to do that. And we're going to utilize all of your budget in the first year just to redesign your site. And you're not going to be able to get the results of that really till many, many months after the launch, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
we said, well, what can we do? Well, we formed a plan to take a rehab approach where we said, let's fix this call to action issue. Let's fix some of this back-end WordPress issues that's causing your site to kind of break in places. Let's update some of this really critical content, that hasn't really been addressed in a long time. And we did that. The first year, we took a rehab approach. We fixed all that stuff. And now we're in year 2 with the client. And we are right in the middle of a website redesign, and we are on the tail end of that engagement. And there have been times where I've thought, okay, has this been the right approach? And it has. Recently, they got a lead for a really, really high, a great prospect for them, and the dollar amount for that prospect. And I don't know, they may be in the middle of negotiation right now. I'm not sure if they've closed it yet. I need to talk to my point of contact, but essentially the current website that hasn't been redesigned generated a lead that could essentially pay for their investment of the redesign probably by 10 times over, only because we decided to fix that call to action issue and those usability issues. Again, the website was generating great traffic, right? But people just weren't taking action because they couldn't find the call to action, and maybe the content was a little dated. So we very much took this rehab approach where we made some changes year 1, and then now we're going to actually rebuild it in year 2. And there's a payoff there, right? It's this incremental approach. And Joe, I'm sure you've got a situation like that where you've recommended to the client, hey, I know it would be really, really fun to rebuild right now. And I know that's going to fix a lot of things like right out of the gate, but it's probably not the smartest move if you want to keep the lead gen engine going and continue to generate the best leads possible right now.
Absolutely. Completely agree. You have to create a balance between putting those foundational pieces in place for your online business development system and doing some things to drive results now. What I've learned from my clients is sometimes you got to go a little bit out of order. And while I'd prefer to make everything perfect and build this big, beautiful, dream website and spend 4 to 6 months doing it, we got to start producing some results like tomorrow.
Yep.
And so you got to find a balance. And so, yeah, I completely agree with what you just said.
And there are things that you can do outside of your website, right? So for this client that I talked about, we're a SharpSpring partner. So that's, marketing automation, CRM. And he was investing money in paid ads. But, again, number one no of probably paid traffic is he was sending everything from AdWords right to his homepage. He didn't have a specific landing pages with specific offers tied to specific keywords. So, there are things, when you're thinking about this rehab option, it's not really necessarily so much with your current website, but think maybe more holistically, hey, let's chop off some of our budget and let's get some really solid landing pages off our website and make use of this paid traffic that we're spending money on month to month to month. I mean, we're paying Google a lot of dollars here. We might as well maximize it. And, who knows what leads could come in as you're redesigning down the road. So I love this idea of rehab. When I wrote my article, Joe, the Dynamite or Fresh Paint one, I led off that article with a concept that I found from Kiss Metrics. And they were exploring this idea of evolution beats revolution. Because, and they made the case that most redesigns are often based purely on aesthetics. So this idea, of evolution beats revolution, I think more times than not, I think a company could take that approach and evolve their site over time rather than just taking a complete sort of eraser and wiping everything clean and starting anew.
Yep, love it. Yeah, and I think the rehab's my favorite. Almost always it's the one that makes the most sense. The fresh coat is kind of a temporary solve. The rehab can allow you to get some of the main stuff done and not use your whole budget doing it and get stuff live fast and bit by bit. It's just that continuous improvement process or evolution that makes so much sense in so many scenarios.
So let's transition into rebuild. So if someone's listening and they're saying, nope, Repaint's not going to work for us because of XYZ. Hey, Rehab sounds cool, but we've been doing that for the last couple of years. We're ready to reboot. Let's talk specifically to those people that are convinced that a rebuild is needed, and maybe we can confirm that for them. Or maybe people are thinking, hey, we just need to repaint. Maybe we need to change those people's minds and get them into thinking about a rebuild. So let's talk through that. I know you got some points to share there on why would it make sense to completely tear it down and rebuild it.
Yeah. And I think you may have more than me to say about this one. So I'm going to go fast. But the first point I have here is a scenario where you have both the luxuries of time and money at your disposal, which probably half the people on this show, or most of them, are kind of laugh at that, because who's got lots of time and money to get stuff done these days? But a full website rebuild it's an intensive project. It involves research, strategy, site mapping, wireframing, design, development, writing, testing. It's a big, long, expensive process. And even if you roll it out in phases, it's a project that takes months, not weeks, in most scenarios. And so you kind of have to just be prepared. If you are going to go that route, it's important to you. You got to be prepared to have that time and a big budget at your disposal. And some companies just want that. It's just, this is what we want. We can wait for lead generation because maybe our pipeline's full and we are doing really well and we're looking to the future. And that's really my second point, is if you just want to take your company to the next level, if you're in growth mode and you're doing well and have your eyes set on sort of what's next. It's the equivalent of building a new house, right? Like you get exactly what you want. You're going to pay for it and you're going to wait for it too. So
love it. Yeah. And yours are more high level, Joe, than mine. Mine are, at least for how I mentioned it in the article that I wrote, are specific things that you can kind of evaluate your website and say, yes, we have like 3 or 4 of these issues. That is a really good indication that we need to rebuild here. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on these things, but if you're listening and you're saying, hey, Eric, Joe, give me some very specific things that I need to be looking at, for me to invest the time and the energy into rebuild. And Joe, just feel free to jump in as I go through these if you want to add to it. But the first one to me is, if your site isn't in a content management system, to me, that just sounds like you've got a really, really dated website, and just switching to a content management system might solve some issues. But ultimately, if you're looking at a site that you're updating the content just through Notepad or something like that, you don't have some sort of back-end utility like WordPress or Drupal or some of the other common content management systems out there, that could be a huge sign, right, that you're ready for a rebuild.
Yep.
Okay. And then the second one I would say is probably dynamic URLs. So if either you're in a really, really old content management system and it's outputting dynamic URLs, which are not going to be SEO friendly, it's a pretty common SEO mistake. And it's just pretty much making your website invisible to Google. That could be another sign, right, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of those technical issues that, sometimes it's just such a mess. And then that's one example that we definitely see sometimes.
A couple other ones would be, so if there's usability issues, right? So I mentioned my client that had some usability issues, and we did take a rehab approach. Now, with that particular client, they were already running WordPress. The usability issues weren't as in like someone just couldn't navigate the site at all. Wasn't that dramatic, but there were enough to at least get on our radar, and we were able to fix that without a rebuild. But there are certain situations where there's just usabilities on every page of the site, whether it's not working in a specific browser, or the back-end code has just got JavaScript errors and things aren't loading properly, or your lead, the page where your lead generation form is on, is just working sporadically for whatever reason. That seems like an easy one to kind of say, yeah, maybe it's time to kind of rethink our entire approach here. An easy one, and you're going to laugh with this one, Joe, is if your site is in Flash, I really hope if you're listening to this, your site is not completely in Flash. I would just say, go grab as much dynamite as possible and blow that thing up as fast as possible. Have you seen that, Joe? Have you seen a site in Flash recently, Joe? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think it's been a little while, but yeah, you see them. When you see them, I think that's the exact approach, is as much dynamite as possible. I mean, it's funny because 12 years ago, we were building some sites in Flash. I mean, we probably shouldn't have been even then, but that's you should not be seeing much of that these days.
Totally hear you on that. A couple other things that are just on my list, and again, maybe what we could do is we could share both of our articles, Joe, if people really want to get into the nitty gritty. But if your content hasn't been updated in years, that's probably a good sign that your products and services have changed quite a bit, right? And if you need to kind of completely gut your content, I would probably say, and Joe, you correct me if you feel differently, I would say that that's probably a huge sign that it's time to rethink not only your website, but at a bigger picture, like who your audience is, do some website specific user personas, get all that research in up front before you actually start designing and rewriting that content. To me, that just screams rebuild everywhere if content hasn't been touched in years and it's very dated.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, usually if your content's that old and dated, it means you probably don't have the right pages on your site. If you don't have the right pages on your site, then it's the whole thing's just going to kind of be a mess. Chances are there's no lead generation infrastructure. There's no learning center or blog, and yeah, that's a sign for sure that it's probably time to blow it up.
Cool. Yeah, and I don't want to labor this point, but again, a lot of people that we have talked to, when we start asking those questions of why, like Joe, you and your agency does as well, is more times than not, we realize that there hasn't been any research done on the user. And, they know their audience fairly well, right? They know the market that they're going after, but they haven't really taken the time to sit down and think through website specific user personas, which is maybe a little bit different than their overall personas of, within marketing. So again, if you haven't done this step and you're looking at a dated website, it could be time to rebuild. It makes sense to start anew rather than repaint or rehab, because if you don't know who your website is for and you start to maybe repaint or rehab, you may be burning some money there and you may be burning some time, and it still may be inaccurate, even though you feel like you've made some good changes. Ultimately, if your website's not speaking to your ideal audience, you're still going to have some issues. All right, Joe. Well, I think that's out of my list. Is there anything on your end that you feel like would be good signs to go into rebuild mode, or have we covered it?
I think you covered your end of it well, and yeah, mine were a little more high level, but that kind of sums it up.
Cool, man. All right. Well, we could keep talking about this for many, many minutes, maybe hours, but let's put a wrap to this. If anyone's listening, Joe, wants to connect with you and learn more about your agency, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I'd say visit gorilla76.com. And in particular, I'd recommend checking out our learning center. We try to practice what we preach and produce as many great resources as we can. And I can be reached by email, joe@gorilla76.com.
And if you're a Chicago Bears fan like I am, you definitely don't have to reach out to Joe. Or I wouldn't say don't reach out to him, but just realize that he is a Green Bay Packer fan before you do reach out to him. So a little bit of a disclaimer there.
You got it.
All right, Joe. Well, man, thank you so much for your time. This has been a lot of fun. I appreciate just all the thought leadership that you put out on Gorilla 76. And, I'm looking forward to staying in contact with you. And, thanks again for making time for this.
Yeah, great conversation. And I appreciate you having me, Eric.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.